If you think HOA Karens only bother people in suburban neighborhoods with neatly trimmed lawns, wait until you hear this, because I never expected one to follow me all the way to my private cabin in the woods. And what happened next could have turned into a full-blown police standoff if I hadn't been prepared. So before I even start, let me tell you, you're going to want to stick around to the very end, because what I pulled out of my truck that day didn't just make Karen's jaw hit the ground. It made 3 police officers step back like they'd seen a ghost. So hit that subscribe button and buckle in, because this story gets wild. I bought my cabin 6 years ago, far away from city life, surrounded by tall pines, a winding gravel driveway, and a yard big enough to store my truck, a TV, and a few work trailers. I wanted peace and privacy, but lately, some so-called lake community down the road had formed an HOA and started acting like their rules extended to my property. They'd sent letters about unsightly storage, unauthorized fencing, and even improper fire pit construction, all of which I ignored because none of it applied to me. The real trouble started when Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA compliance chair, decided to make it her personal mission to bring me in line. I'd seen her peeking from her SUV at the end of my driveway, taking pictures. At first, I shrugged it off until last Saturday morning when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked out my cabin window to see how Karen, in her pastel cardigan and oversized sunglasses, strutting up my yard like she owned the place. She didn't even knock, just started snapping photos of my stacked firewood, my parked trailers, and the shed I'd built last summer. I stepped outside and told her she was trespassing, but she just gave me that smug smile and said, "We've had several complaints about this mess, and I'm documenting violations before I call in enforcement." I laughed and told her she had no authority here. But she whipped out her phone and dialed, I kid you not, -911. "Yes, I'm at 42 Pine Hollow Lane," she told the dispatcher loudly enough for me to hear, "and there's an aggressive man refusing to comply with community rules. He has dangerous equipment in the open. Please send someone before this escalates." I couldn't believe it. She was actually trying to frame me as some kind of threat. 10 minutes later, 2 sheriffs, deputies, and a state trooper pulled up. Karen ran to them like a damsel in distress, pointing at my yard and telling them I was belligerent and possibly armed. The deputies walked over cautiously, hands near their holsters, and asked if I had any weapons on me. I told them no, but I did have something to show them, something that would explain exactly why Karen had no business here. They exchanged glances, probably expecting me to pull out a rifle or a chainsaw. Instead, I walked over to my truck, opened the locked toolbox in the bed, and pulled out a thick black binder with a gold federal seal on the front. The second the trooper saw it, his eyebrows shot up. I flipped it open to reveal my credentials. I'm a retired federal law enforcement officer with active reserve status for emergencies. The deputies went from cautious to respectful in a heartbeat. Karen froze mid-step as she realized the aggressive man she'd called the cops on had more legal authority than she'd ever dreamed of. I explained calmly that she was trespassing, harassing me, and filing false police reports. The trooper told her she was lucky I wasn't pressing charges yet. Karen's face turned crimson, and she sputtered about just doing her job. But one of the deputies told her plainly, "Ma'am, this isn't HOA jurisdiction. You need to leave." She stomped back to her SUV and peeled out of my driveway, but I knew this wasn't over. She'd been embarrassed, and people like her don't let that slide. I decided right then that the next time she tried something, I'd be ready to not just shut her down, but make sure the HOA thought twice before ever stepping foot on my property again. I didn't know it yet, but that next time would come sooner than I imagined. It wouldn't just involve Karen. It would drag in the entire HOA board, half the sheriff's department, and even a news crew. And by the end of it, let's just say Karen would wish she'd never even heard of Pine Hollow Lane, much less tried to control it. The officers stepped closer, their boots crunching over the gravel. And I could see the slight flicker of uncertainty in their eyes as they glanced around at the property. My cabin yard wasn't just any yard. It was a sprawling patch of well-maintained land that opened up to the forest, with a wide barn on one side and a tool shed on the other, both older than most buildings in this county, but still in pristine condition, because I kept them that way. Karen had wedged herself between the officers now. hands flailing as she explained in exaggerated detail how my yard was an eyesore to the community, accusing me of harboring dangerous equipment and possible wild animals. It was almost comical how her voice pitched up every time she tried to make me sound like some backwoods criminal. One officer, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard, tried to get a word in, asking her calmly, "Ma'am, has there been any threat to your safety or anyone else's?" But Karen bulldozed over him with more nonsense about unsanctioned land use and unauthorized structures. My patience was wearing thin. I had already put in the request months ago to be excluded from the HOA's jurisdiction because my property was just outside their official mapped boundary. But Karen refused to acknowledge it, acting like my cabin yard was her personal battlefield. I crossed my arms and leaned against the post near my porch, letting her dig herself deeper while the officers began to realize that her story didn't hold much water. My dog, Duke, a massive but gentle German shepherd, trotted out from behind. The Barnon stood beside me, his calm but watchful gaze fixed on the group. Karen gasped and stumbled back like she'd just seen a bear, pointing frantically. "That's one of them," she shrieked. The younger officer glanced at Duke, then back at her. "One of what, ma'am?" She hesitated, realizing she'd said too much, before stammering, "One of the dangerous animals I told you about." Duke simply sat down, wagging his tail lazily, which earned a raised eyebrow from the second officer, a taller man with broad shoulders who was clearly not buying her act. I finally stepped forward, my voice calm but cutting. "Gentlemen, if you'd like, I can show you exactly what's in my yard so we can end this little performance." The younger officer nodded, clearly interested in verifying the facts for himself. Karen, however, tried to protest, saying, "You don't know what you're walking into. Is hiding something," but I cut her off with a small smirk. "You're right about that," I said, my eyes locking on hers, "but it's probably not what you think." I led the officers toward the barn, Karen trailing behind reluctantly, muttering under her breath about HOA violations and the good of the neighborhood. As we approached, I unlocked the heavy barn doors and swung them open, revealing a neatly organized interior. There were tools hanging in perfect alignment on one wall, stacks of lumber sorted by size, and two old but immaculate TVs parked side by side. Karen's jaw tightened. This was not the chaotic, dangerous mess she had described. "This is all legal, licensed, and safe," I said, gesturing to the space. "Want to see the other thing you're so worried about?" The taller officer nodded, his expression unreadable. I walked to the back of the barn, unlatched a smaller side door, and gestured them outside toward a fenced-off area behind the shed. Karen was still muttering until we turned the corner, and her words stopped cold. What she saw made her freeze. Mid-step, her face pale, her mouth slightly open. She had wanted to make me look like a threat, but she hadn't expected this. By the next morning, the incident had become the talk of the neighborhood, though none of them knew the full truth. I woke early, grabbed my coffee, and sat on the porch, my eyes scanning the quiet road for any signs of activity. I knew Karen. Wouldn't leave it alone. She was the kind who'd nurse a grudge until it consumed her, but I didn't expect her to show up so soon. Around 8:15, I spotted her SUV crawling past my cabin like a predator scouting its prey. She slowed down. Near the gate, her phone up like she was taking pictures. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, plotting her next move. Instead of confronting her, I let her stew. The truth was, I had already started laying a trap of my own. Inside my cabin was a case filled with documents, permits, and legal rights tied to the property proof that the HOA had zero authority here, but that wasn't the only thing in the case. I also had a few surprises that would rattle even the boldest troublemaker. I spent the day casually moving about the yard, trimming a few branches and stacking wood, but every so often I'd glance at the road. She came by again in the afternoon, this time with another HOA board member riding shotgun. They slowed down, pretending to look at something in the distance, but their eyes were locked on me. I could feel the hostility radiating from them like heat from a fire. It was almost funny how obvious they were. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I heard tires crunching on gravel Karen had pulled into my driveway uninvited. She stepped out, holding a clipboard, like it was a weapon. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight and impatient. I leaned back against the porch rail and gave her the kind of slow look that made it clear I wasn't impressed. Well, she started, rambling about yard maintenance, property appearance, and community standards, waving the clipboard for emphasis. I let her finish her little speech before asking, "You do know this land isn't under your HOA's jurisdiction, right?" She blinked, caught off guard for just a second, but quickly recovered. "All properties within visible range of the association are subject to visual compliance," she declared like she was reciting some made-up law. I couldn't help but chuckle. "That's not how the law works, Karen," I said, pushing off the railing and walking toward her. Her grip on the clipboard tightened, but I could see her confidence slipping. I decided to up the ante. "You really want to make this official? Fine, let's make it official." Turned, walked into the cabin, and came back with the locked case I had been preparing. Setting it on the porch table, I flipped it open slowly, letting her see the neatly organized stack of legal documents and photographs. "This is everything you need to know about why you're stepping way out of bounds," I told her. "And if you push me, I'll make sure this doesn't just stay a neighborhood issue, it'll become a legal one." Karen stared at the contents, her jaw tightening. She tried to hide it, but I could see the uncertainty creeping in. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. "We'll see about that," she said sharply, turning on her heel and stomping back to her SUV. I watched her drive off, my gut telling me this was far from over. The real storm was still coming, and I had the feeling it would arrive sooner than I thought. The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut with a knife as the cops fanned out, clearly still uncertain about how to handle the situation. And Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed and lips tight, clearly expecting the officers to force me into some sort of compliance. But the truth was that she had walked herself right into a mess she had no control over. I leaned casually against the cabin railing, my hands steady and my eyes locked on the officer who seemed to be taking charge. A tall man with a no-nonsense expression who kept glancing at Karen like he was trying to decide whether she was a reliable source or just another call they'd have to quietly roll their eyes at once it was over. "Sir, she claims you have something dangerous in the yard," he finally said. His tone cautious but not aggressive, and I could feel Karen's smug little smirk aimed right at me. But she had no idea what was actually going to happen next. "I do," I replied evenly, watching their faces tense, "and I have no issue showing you exactly what it is." I could see Karen's eyebrows shoot up, clearly thinking she'd won. And the two officers looked like they were already running through worst-case scenarios in their heads. Without rushing, I turned and headed toward the large storage shed. Near the back of the yard, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the otherwise silent air. And every step I took seemed to ratchet up the tension. The shed door creaked open as I pulled it wide, and I heard the distinct click of someone's safety being checked behind me, the cops ready for anything. Karen was practically bouncing on her heels, the excitement of what she thought was my impending downfall lighting up her face. I reached inside, my hand brushing past various tools and supplies, before pulling out what I'd been waiting to show them all along. Something that would completely change the direction of this little drama. In my hands was a polished, custom-framed document encased in glass, with a thick official seal pressed into the corner, the kind of thing that wasn't just paper but a piece of authority. I stepped forward and held it out toward the lead officer, who took it cautiously and glanced down, his eyes scanning the text before suddenly widening just a fraction. He turned it toward the second officer, who immediately straightened his posture, his demeanor shifting from guarded curiosity to something much more formal. "Gosh." Karen squinted at it from where she stood, unable to read the small print, but her smugness faltered when she noticed the sudden respect in the officer's tone. "Where did you get this?" the lead officer asked, his voice lower now, and I smiled faintly. "From the United States Department of Homeland Security," I said. Karen's eyes flickered with confusion, and I knew she was desperately trying to connect the dots. The truth was that framed document was my official federal clearance, a symbol of the fact that I wasn't just some cabin owner in the woods, but someone with jurisdiction and authority that reached far beyond anything she could comprehend. I watched the lead officer hand it back with a slight nod, his entire stance now relaxed, but respectful. When Karen tried to step forward to demand an explanation, one of the cops actually held a hand up to stop her. "Hey, ma'am, I think you've misunderstood the situation," the officer told her, his voice firm. "You have no grounds to be interfering here." The look on her face was priceless, a mixture of confusion, frustration, and the slow realization that she was no longer in control. I walked back toward the cabin, the framed document still in my hand, and glanced over my shoulder at her. "Next time, Karen. Maybe knock before calling in reinforcements," I said evenly, before turning my back and heading inside, leaving her standing there with the officers, who were now clearly done entertaining her little crusade. By the following week, the weather had taken a sharp turn, crisp mountain air carrying with it the scent of wet pine and distant rain. I was standing on the porch of my cabin early in the morning, sipping coffee and watching a light mist roll down the slopes, when I saw movement down by the road. Through the haze, I made out the familiar figure of Karen, flanked by two unfamiliar men in blazers, clearly not uniformed officers this time, but the kind who thought they could project authority just by wearing a cheap badge on a belt. They moved slowly, scanning the yard, as though searching for something specific, whispering in low tones to one another while Karen pointed at my property and gestured in that exaggerated way she always did. I stayed perfectly still, waiting, to see if they had the nerve to walk up the driveway. Sure enough, they did. By the time they reached the porch steps, I had set down my coffee and leaned casually on the railing. One of the men, the taller one with slicked back hair, spoke first. Introducing himself as private security contracted by the HOA, I nearly laughed. Private security? Out here, he informed me, they were there to inspect the boundaries of the property after multiple complaints about encroachments on community land. I reminded him calmly that this was not HOA land, and that any attempt to step further onto my property without a court order would be trespassing. Karen, standing behind them with that smug little smirk, muttered something about me trying to hide things in my yard. I turned slowly toward her, letting my voice drop just enough to make the moment heavy. "Karen, do you remember what happened last time you tried to involve law enforcement here?" Her smirk faltered, but she tried to mask it by looking away. The shorter security guy, clearly the less confident of the two, shifted uncomfortably and asked if they could at least take some photos from the property line. I told them they could take all the photos they wanted from the public road. When they hesitated, I reminded them of the large note trespassing signs posted clearly at the entrance to my driveway. Then, to make my point, I slowly reached into the nearby storage box on the porch and pulled out the same heavy-duty surveying equipment I'd used before: tripods, laser levels, high-precision GPS Garral, of it clearly professional and far beyond anything they could argue with. The tall man blinked, clearly thrown off, and asked what I was doing. I told him, "If you're so worried about boundaries, let's get exact measurements right now. We'll see how much HOA land this cabin supposedly sits on." I started unpacking the equipment piece by piece, calling out coordinates and lining up markers while speaking just loud enough for Karen to hear every word. She was visibly rattled. She hated when I brought out anything that showed I knew more about the legal and technical aspects of land ownership than she ever would. The two security men exchanged glances, obviously realizing they were in over their heads. The taller one mumbled something about needing to confirm with the board, and motioned to his partner to start heading back down the driveway. Karen followed reluctantly, her confidence clearly shaken, but her pride still refusing to let her walk away without some parting shot. She turned back and said, "This isn't over. You can't just bully people with your fancy toys." I smiled faintly and replied, "It's not bullying when it's the truth, Karen. And you might want to be careful who you send up here next time, because the next visitor might not be as polite as I am." She didn't respond, just spun on her heel and walked quickly toward her car, muttering under her breath. As they pulled away, I watched their taillights disappear down the winding road, knowing full well they'd be back in some form or another. Karen never let things go. She was the kind of person who would rather lose a battle 100 times than admit she'd been wrong once. But what she didn't know was that I had been preparing for exactly this kind of escalation from the very beginning. And I was ready to meet her on any front she chose, whether it was legal, physical, or psychological. The game wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase, and I was more than ready for it. As I stood in my cabin yard that afternoon, the tension in the air was like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. The small crowd of HOA members, including Karen, still lingered by the fence line, whispering among themselves with tight, judgmental expressions, though the police officers had already told them to disperse. The incident from the previous day had clearly shaken them, yet Karen's ego wouldn't allow her to simply back down. I could see her pacing near the edge of the driveway, occasionally gesturing toward my property as if she were describing some outrageous scene that hadn't even happened. Meanwhile, I spent the early hours quietly reinforcing the boundary of my yard marking posts, clearing brush, and making sure the cabin grounds were in top condition. It wasn't just about maintaining appearances anymore. It was about control. Over what was mine? By noon, I heard the distinct sound of tires crunching over gravel, and when I stepped to the front porch, I saw a dark SUV pulling up. It wasn't the police this time. It was my friend James, a wildlife officer for the state, who'd heard about this situation through some mutual acquaintances. His expression was a mix of concern and curiosity. "Heard you had a run-in with your local power structure," he said dryly, stepping out with a folder tucked under his arm. I waved him in, but before we could even get halfway inside, Karen marched up the driveway, flanked by 2 HOA board members. She didn't even acknowledge James. Her attention was locked on me. "You're in violation of community rules again," she declared loudly, holding up a paper that looked suspiciously like another bogus citation. "Your yard is out of compliance with HOA landscaping standards, and if you refuse to correct it, we will fine you daily." I raised an eyebrow and pointed toward the boundary markers I'd just set. "Those aren't even on your jurisdiction's property," I replied calmly. "The HOA line ends 20 feet back from where you're standing." Karen scoffed and said, "The HOA rules apply to all properties adjacent to our community, and your so-called cabin yard is a visual nuisance to our residents." At this point, James stepped forward, pulling out his wildlife officer credentials. His tone was steady, but edged with authority. "Actually, ma'am, this property is classified as private rural land under state jurisdiction, not your HOA." The way Karen's face twitched, you'd think someone had just told her the sun was fake. She turned to the board members for backup, but neither of them could meet her eyes. James continued, "Furthermore, this area is a designated wildlife corridor. The brush piles and natural landscaping you're complaining about are actually encouraged under conservation policy." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The HOA members tried to regroup, muttering about aesthetic values and community standards, but James cut them off again, adding, "You might also want to be aware that interfering with wildlife habitat on private property can result in hefty state fines. Real fines, not those pieces of paper you've been waving around." A few neighbors had gathered near the road, phones out, recording the interaction. The mix of murmurs and suppressed laughter didn't help Karen's composure. She snapped, "This isn't over," before turning on her heel and storming off, but the tension she left behind was thicker than ever. James shook his head and muttered, "Some people just don't know when to quit." We went inside, and over coffee, I explained more about the escalating incidents, from the fake citations to the police calls. James told me that he could officially document the wildlife corridor status for my yard, making it essentially untouchable by HOA interference. It was the first real shield I'd had in this ongoing fight, and I could see how it could be used strategically. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat easily, and I knew she'd find another angle soon. Sure enough, later that evening, I caught sight of her walking with another board member down the street, pointing toward my cabin and jotting notes in a small pad. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language screamed determination. My phone buzzed. Just as they disappeared from view, it was a text from an unknown number. "Watch your back. She's planning something bigger." The moment Karen's eyes landed on what I had just pulled from the cabin's shed, her smug expression cracked like glass under a hammer. The cops who had been standing at her side froze, their postures stiffening as they exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure if they should step forward or back away entirely. The neighbors who had gathered at the edge of my yard went silent, their phones still held in front of them to record, but their whispers now replaced with tense breathing. I could almost hear the creak of the wooden dock behind me as the lake lapped against it, the air thick with that electric stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. Karen's voice, which had been so sharp and shrill minutes before, was gone. Now she looked at me like she had just realized she was playing a game she could never win. I didn't say a word at first, letting the weight of the moment hang, letting her think about all the times she had trespassed, harassed, and called the cops on nothing but her imagination. The officers finally spoke, their tone far more careful, now asking if they could approach, but I made sure they knew I wasn't intimidated. Karen took a small step back, and for the first time, she wasn't in control of the scene she had orchestrated. The crowd began to shift, their faces changing from curiosity to realization, some even looking at Karen with quiet judgment. I explained clearly and deliberately what I had pulled out and why it was completely within my rights. Watching the officers nod slowly as the legality sank in, Karen's cheeks burned red as the authority she thought she had evaporated right in front of her. She muttered something about not knowing before quickly retreating toward her house, the crowd's eyes following her like a walk of shame. The cops apologized for the disturbance, explaining they had been called under false pretenses and advised me to keep record of everything. As the last police cruiser pulled away and the neighbors began dispersing, I could feel the shift in the air. Karen wasn't just embarrassed, she was defeated. She wouldn't recover from this one, and everyone in the community knew it. If you want to see exactly how this battle ended and the way Karen's downfall played out for the entire HOA to witness, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories right now so you don't miss the explosive finale.